The alarm goes off and you silence it before it finishes the first ring. Not because you are rested, not because you are ready, but because lying there one more second feels like more than you can carry. You get up. You go through the motions.
Coffee.
Mirror. The face looking back at you is familiar, but the feeling behind the eyes is distant. Something that used to spark curiosity, excitement, even ordinary satisfaction, is just quiet now. Not sad, exactly. Not broken. Just flat. We have all felt versions of this. The moment when even the things we care about most stop producing feeling. When the people we love most get the last of whatever we have left. When rest does not restore us. When a full weekend of doing nothing still sends us back to Monday feeling hollow. This is not weakness. This is not laziness. This is what happens when you have been running on emotional debt for so long that the account finally empties. What is at stake is not just your energy. It is your ability to feel your own life. And the cost of leaving this unaddressed is not one bad season. It is years of going through days that look fine from the outside, while something essential in you quietly disappears. But here is what I want you to know before we go any further. This is recoverable, not through pushing harder, not through fixing your schedule, through understanding what actually happened to you and why it was never just about work. You did not end up here because you are fragile. You ended up here because you gave too much for too long without giving anything back to yourself, and then felt guilty every time you tried. That is the part most conversations about burnout completely miss. They talk about workload, about boundaries, about rest. And those things matter. But what they rarely name is the layer underneath all of that, the emotional labor of constantly monitoring yourself, criticizing yourself, carrying guilt for resting, for saying no, for wanting more, for not being enough. That interior labor is exhausting in a way that no amount of sleep can fix. You may have already watched or listened to Stop Punishing Yourself, The Art of Self-Compassion, and How to Stop Feeling Guilty for Putting Yourself First on this channel. If you have, what we are doing right now is the natural continuation of that work. Because emotional burnout is where unprocessed guilt and relentless self-criticism eventually land. It is the destination of a journey you never meant to be on. Here is what this audiobook is going to help you with. You're going to understand why you feel the way you feel right now, not as a character flaw, but as a logical outcome of specific emotional patterns. You are going to understand the difference between physical tiredness and emotional depletion, and why treating them the same way keeps you stuck. You are going to learn how to restore feeling gradually and safely, how to rebuild your capacity for joy without performing it, and how to re-enter your own life in a way that is sustainable this time. This audiobook is not going to tell you to take a bubble bath and call it recovery. It is not going to hand you a morning routine and promise everything changes. Real burnout recovery is slower and stranger than that, and I am going to walk every step of it with you honestly. We are starting at the bottom of the well, and by the time we reach the final chapter, you're going to understand exactly how you got here, what it is going to take to get out, and who you are becoming on the other side of this. Let us begin. Chapter 1. When empty is not the same as broken. You are sitting in a conversation with someone who matters to you. They are telling you something important. And somewhere in the middle of it you realize, with a quiet kind of horror, that you are not really there. You are nodding. You are producing the right sounds. But the part of you that used to genuinely engage, that used to feel interest and warmth and presence, is somewhere far away. That moment of watching yourself go through the motions, that is one of the loneliest experiences a human being can have. We do not talk about it because it sounds cold. It sounds like we have stopped caring about people we love. But that is not what is happening. And the shame of not being able to explain it makes the whole thing worse. We carry the disconnection alone, which deepens it, which drains more of what is left. Here is what I have come to understand about that experience. Emotional numbness is not the absence of feeling. It is the nervous system's protective response to sustained overload. When we have been operating in a state of chronic emotional stress, guilt, self-criticism, the relentless pressure of managing other people's needs while suppressing our own, the brain does not break down dramatically. It dims. It turns the volume down on everything as a form of self-preservation. Dr. Judith Herman, who spent decades researching trauma and emotional exhaustion, described this dimming as the psyche creating distance between itself and stimuli it no longer has the resources to process. In plain terms, you go numb because going numb is the kindest thing your nervous system knows how to do when it has nothing left. This means numbness is not failure. It is information. Your system is telling you something real. The question is whether you are willing to listen. Think about what this looks like in your actual life right now. The hobbies that used to restore you feel like obligations. You look forward to nothing specific. You finish tasks competently, but without satisfaction. Small annoyances feel disproportionately heavy, and real joy feels temporarily out of reach. This is not who you are. This is what sustained depletion looks like in a person who kept going when they should have stopped. The practical tool for this chapter is what I call the flatline check. Once a day for the next 7 days, sit quietly for 3 minutes and ask yourself one question. What did I feel today? Not what did I do? Not how did I perform, but what did I actually feel? Write a single word, if you can find one. Write nothing if that is honest. The act of turning toward your own emotional state, even when it feels empty, is the first movement in any real recovery. You are not trying to manufacture feeling. You are simply beginning to pay attention to what is actually there. The truth is this: you are not broken. You are depleted. And those are not the same thing at all. What we need to look at next is how you got here, because the path into burnout is rarely the one people expect. Chapter 2: The Hidden Labor Nobody Counted. You were never the person who did the least. If anything, you were the one who did more. More than was asked. More than was fair. More than you had energy for. And when someone pointed that out, you probably found a way to minimize it, to say it was fine, that you did not mind, that you wanted to help. That internal move, dismissing your own cost, is something so many of us learned early. We learned it so well, it became automatic. We absorbed messages, often before we had words for them, about what made us worthy. That worthiness was conditional, that it had to be earned through output, through sacrifice, through never being the one who needed too much. And so we built an entire interior architecture around meeting that condition, monitoring ourselves constantly, working harder than we needed to, carrying guilt the moment we slowed down. Here is what I want to name clearly. Emotional labor is the invisible work of managing your inner world so that your outer world runs smoothly. It is the energy you spend before any task even begins, reassuring yourself that you are doing enough, suppressing the fatigue you do not feel allowed to admit, managing the anxiety of potentially disappointing someone. Sociologist Arlie Hochschild, who first brought this concept into serious research, described emotional labor as the management of feeling to create a publicly observable facial and bodily display. But what she found, and what matters for you right now, is that this management has a cost, and that cost is cumulative. Every time you push down your own needs to tend to someone else, a cost was logged. Every time you kept going when you were already running low, a cost was logged. Every time you criticized yourself for wanting rest, a cost was logged. These costs do not disappear. They compound. Think about your relationship with the word enough. When did you last feel genuinely, quietly satisfied that you had done enough for one day? Not relieved that the day was over. Not numb from exhaustion. Actually content that you had given what was appropriate and that your own needs were also real and valid. If you cannot easily locate that feeling, that tells you something important about how long you have been running this pattern. The practical tool for this chapter is the labor ledger. At the end of today, take 5 minutes and write down 2 columns. In the first column, write everything you gave emotionally today: your attention, your patience, your reassurance, your suppressed frustration, your managed anxiety. In the second column, write what you received today: genuine acknowledgement, rest, pleasure, connection that felt mutual. You're not doing this to build resentment. You're doing this to see clearly, perhaps for the first time, how long the ledger has been unbalanced. Seeing the imbalance without judgment is what makes it possible to correct it. You carried more than was yours to carry, and it is time to look at that honestly. The next question we need to sit with is this: why did guilt become the thing that kept you carrying it? Chapter 3. Why guilt kept the engine running. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from what you did, but from what you would not let yourself stop doing. The exhaustion of pushing through the moment your body said enough, because something in you believed that stopping was the same as failing. That belief has a name, and it lives in a lot of people who appear from the outside to be functioning just fine. We were taught implicitly, persistently, that rest had to be earned, that slowing down was acceptable only after everything was done. And since everything is never done, we built a life with no legitimate exit from the doing. Guilt became the mechanism that enforced that system. Any time we got close to resting, close to prioritizing ourselves, close to saying no, guilt arrived to pull us back into motion. Here is what I have come to understand about guilt and burnout. They are not separate problems. Guilt is the fuel that makes burnout possible. Psychologist Kristen Neff, whose research on self-compassion has changed the way we understand emotional suffering, found that chronic self-criticism activates the same threat response pathways in the brain as external danger. Your own voice, turned against yourself, registers as a threat. And your nervous system responds to that threat by producing the same stress hormones it would produce if you were in actual danger, consistently, relentlessly, every time you failed to meet your own impossible standard. This means that burnout is not simply the result of doing too much. It is the result of doing too much while simultaneously punishing yourself for not doing it better, not doing it faster, not doing it without complaining. The double load of action and self-criticism is what depletes you faster than either alone. Think about the last time you genuinely rested without a background sense of unease, without checking something, without a low-level awareness that you should be doing more. For many people in burnout, real rest, the kind that actually restores, has not been accessible for months or years. Not because they did not have time, because guilt would not allow them to fully arrive in the rest they had. The practical tool for this chapter is the guilt interrupt. The next time you feel guilt rising as you rest, slow down, or prioritize yourself, do not argue with it and do not obey it. Instead, say internally, "This feeling is familiar, not factual. Guilt feels like evidence." It is not. It is a learned response. By naming it for what it is, a conditioned alarm, not a moral verdict, you create just enough distance to choose your response rather than be controlled by it. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Drop your answer in the comments right now. When was the last time you rested without guilt, and what made it feel acceptable? I read every comment, and your answer might shape the next audiobook we create together. You have spent long enough letting guilt write the terms of your recovery. The next chapter is about what burnout is actually doing to your body while that interior battle is running. Chapter 4. What burnout does below the surface. You probably know the feeling of waking up after 8 hours of sleep and still feeling as though you never closed your eyes. That is not a sleep problem. It is a nervous system problem. And understanding the difference is the beginning of treating it correctly. We tend to think of exhaustion as a simple equation. Exert energy, deplete energy, rest, restore. But chronic emotional burnout disrupts that cycle at a physiological level in ways that do not respond to ordinary rest. Most of us, when we finally acknowledge we are burned out, try to fix it with the same strategies we would use for ordinary tiredness. We take a day off. We sleep in on the weekend. We cut back on 1 or 2 commitments. And when those things do not work, when we still feel hollow and flat despite doing all the right things, we quietly conclude that something must be fundamentally wrong with us, that we are not the kind of person who can recover, that this is just who we are now. That conclusion is not just incorrect. It is one of the most damaging things burnout produces because it stops you from doing the things that would actually help. Here is what I want you to understand about what is happening in your body. Herbert Freudenberger, the psychologist who first clinically defined burnout in the 1970s, described it not as simple fatigue, but as the extinction of motivation and incentive. He was working with dedicated volunteers in free clinics who were giving everything and receiving nothing back, and he watched them not just tire but hollow out. What he identified, and what decades of research since has confirmed, is that burnout produces measurable changes in the brain's reward system. The areas responsible for generating anticipation, pleasure, and motivation begin to underperform, not because they are damaged, but because they have been chronically overstimulated and under-resourced. This is why you cannot think your way out of numbness. You cannot motivate yourself out of it either. You need to understand that your reward circuitry has gone quiet as a protective measure, and that restoring it requires a specific kind of input that most people in burnout are accidentally withholding from themselves. What does this look like practically in your daily life? You likely find yourself seeking stimulation, screens, noise, food, anything that produces a temporary signal, while simultaneously feeling unsatisfied by all of it. You are chasing activation that your depleted system cannot quite generate. This is not addiction or weakness. It is the symptom of a reward system that has been running on empty for too long. The practical tool for this chapter is what I call micro-pleasure mapping. Today, make a list of 5 things that used to give you uncomplicated, simple pleasure. Not achievement, not productivity. Pleasure. A specific meal. A walk at a particular time of day. A song. A texture. A smell. You do not need to feel anything when you write the list. The point is to identify targets for deliberate, low-pressure exposure. Over the next week, choose one each day and give it your full attention for 5 uninterrupted minutes, not to force enjoyment, but to begin gently re-engaging the circuits that burnout has quieted. Recovery begins below the level of thought, and it begins with something smaller and more specific than you might expect. What feeds burnout at the relationship level, though, is a layer we have not yet touched, and it is one of the most important. Chapter 5. The relationships that drain without filling. You love certain people, and being around them leaves you more tired than before you arrived. You know that experience. The phone call that ends and requires a recovery period. The family dinner you mentally rehearse for days in advance. The colleague whose approval you spend unconscious energy managing. These are not bad people necessarily, but they are connections that cost more than they give, and the fact that you feel guilty saying so is part of the problem. We carry a particular cultural guilt around naming relational drain. It feels disloyal. It feels cold. It feels like an indictment of people we genuinely love. And so instead of naming it, we manage it silently. We show up depleted and perform presence. We suppress the fatigue of high-maintenance dynamics and call it love or duty or just the way things are. Here is what this costs. The energy you spend managing, monitoring, and performing in draining relationships is energy that cannot go toward your own restoration. Burnout does not happen in isolation. It happens inside a relational ecosystem, and the texture of that ecosystem either accelerates recovery or prevents it. Harriet Lerner, the clinical psychologist and author whose work on relationships and emotional patterns has guided countless people through exactly this kind of reckoning, spent decades studying how we lose ourselves in our closest connections. She found that the people most vulnerable to burnout are often those most committed to preserving other people's comfort at the expense of their own honesty. They do not set limits because limits feel cruel. They do not express needs because needs feel like impositions. And the result is a slow accumulation of unexpressed reality that becomes its own form of exhaustion. Think about the relationships in your life right now and ask yourself, with genuine honesty, which ones leave me feeling more like myself, and which ones require me to perform a version of myself that is not quite true. That question is not an invitation to exit relationships or assign blame. It is an invitation to see clearly because you cannot restore energy you do not know is being spent. The practical tool for this chapter is the relational energy audit. Take 3 relationships. Choose them instinctively, whichever 3 come to mind first, and after your next interaction with each one, spend 2 minutes noting, do I feel more resourced or less resourced than before this interaction? You are not evaluating these people. You are mapping your energy. Over 2 to 3 weeks of honest tracking, a pattern will emerge. And patterns, once visible, become possible to work with. You are allowed to notice the cost of the love you give. Noticing is not betrayal. It is the beginning of sustainability. The piece of burnout recovery that people resist most, though, is not the one about relationships. It is the one about identity. And that is where we're going next. Chapter 6. Who you became to survive. There is a version of you that was built for endurance, that knows exactly how to keep going when everything says stop. That is calm in crisis, reliable under pressure, available when others fall apart. That version of you is genuinely admirable. And that version of you is part of what got you here. We do not arrive at burnout by being irresponsible. We arrive at it by being so responsible, so capable, so consistently available that the entire system, interior and exterior, began to depend on us never needing anything back. At some point, and for most people this happened gradually and without a single clear moment, the capacity for endurance stopped being something you had and became something you were. Your identity merged with your function. Being the person who handles things became the way you understood your own value. And so the possibility of stopping, of needing help, of being temporarily incapable, stopped feeling like an option. It started feeling like a threat to who you are. Here is what I want to say about that directly. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor who built his entire life's work on the question of meaning and human endurance, wrote that between stimulus and response, there is always a space, and that in that space lies our freedom. He was writing about the most extreme conditions a human being can face. And what he found, even there, was that identity could be chosen rather than simply inherited from circumstance. The identity you built around endurance was adaptive. It helped you survive real pressures. But adaptive identities become traps the moment the conditions that created them are gone, or the moment the cost of maintaining them exceeds the benefit. You are not your productivity. You are not your availability. You are not the sum of what you do for others. And the recovery of your actual self, curious, spacious, capable of receiving as well as giving, begins with questioning the story you built about what makes you worth keeping around. In your daily life, this pattern shows up as discomfort with stillness, difficulty receiving help or compliments, and internal restlessness when nothing is being accomplished, and a quiet fear that if you slow down, people will see you are not as indispensable as you appeared. These are not character flaws. They are the psychological residue of building your identity around function. The practical tool for this chapter is the identity separation practice. On a blank page, draw a line down the middle. On the left, write what you do. On the right, write who you are when you are not doing anything. If the right column feels impossible to fill, that itself is the information. Spend 5 minutes, once a day for 1 week, adding one thing to the right column that has nothing to do with your usefulness to anyone else. If what you are hearing is already shifting something inside you, subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell, because the next audiobook goes even deeper into how to rebuild your sense of self after years of running on empty, and you do not want to miss it. You are more than what you produce. The next chapter is about learning to feel that truth rather than just thinking it. Chapter 7. The slow work of feeling again. You have probably had a moment, brief and unexpected, where something broke through the flatness. A piece of music that hit differently. A quiet morning that felt almost like peace. A conversation that made you briefly, genuinely laugh. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. And the flatness returned. And perhaps you wondered whether you had imagined it. You did not imagine it. That breakthrough is real. And it is telling you something important. The capacity for feeling is still there. It has not gone. It has been buried under layers of protection that your nervous system built to keep you going when feeling would have made it impossible to continue. We live in a culture that pathologizes slowness, that treats the inability to bounce back quickly as a personal failure. And so people in burnout often try to accelerate their own recovery through willpower, forcing themselves to feel grateful, motivated, enthusiastic, and when it does not work, concluding that they are somehow beyond the reach of the normal tools. Here is what the research actually shows about emotional recovery. Bessel van der Kolk, the psychiatrist and trauma researcher whose landmark work on how the body processes emotional experience changed the entire field, found that the path back to emotional presence is never through thinking alone. The body holds the state that the mind is trying to escape. And recovery of genuine feeling requires bottom-up processing, starting with physical sensation, breath, movement, and sensory experience before cognitive understanding can take hold. This means you cannot think your way back to feeling. You have to move your way back. Breathe your way back. Be present in your body in the specific, ordinary moments of your actual day. Not through performance of wellness, through genuine, small, physical acts of presence. What this looks like in your life right now, you might try to feel more by consuming more content, more stimulus, more social engagement, and find yourself feeling emptier. That is because the path back to genuine feeling runs through slowing down and paying attention to what is actually already there, not through seeking stronger input. The practical tool for this chapter is the sensory anchor practice. Once a day, choose one completely ordinary physical experience. Drinking your morning coffee, stepping outside, washing your hands, and give it your complete, deliberate attention for 60 seconds. Not to manufacture meaning, just to arrive fully in your own sensory experience. Notice temperature. Notice texture. Notice the weight of your own body in the moment. This practice, done consistently, begins to rebuild the neural pathways of present moment awareness that burnout systematically dismantles. Feeling comes back the way color returns to a limb that has been numb, gradually, imperfectly, with occasional sharp and unexpected intensity. What you do with the relationships and structures around you while feeling comes back, that is the territory of our next chapter. Chapter 8. Rebuilding without repeating the pattern. The most dangerous moment in burnout recovery is the first moment you feel better. not because feeling better is bad, but because feeling better is frequently mistaken for being recovered. And the person who is burned out by overgiving, overfunctioning, and self-erasure will, at the first sign of restored energy, immediately give it all away again. This is not a character flaw. It is the pattern reasserting itself. Because the pattern was built over years, and it knows exactly how to make itself feel like the right thing to do. We have to talk about what rebuilding actually looks like, because it is not simply rest followed by return to normal. If normal was the condition that produced burnout, returning to normal is returning to the cause. Stephen Covey, the author whose thinking on effectiveness and principle-centered living has genuinely changed the way millions of people organize their time and energy, introduced a distinction that is directly relevant here. He described the difference between urgent and important, observing that most depleted people spend the majority of their energy on things that feel urgent but are not actually important, while the important things that would genuinely restore and sustain them get continuously deferred. He called the space of important but not urgent the quadrant of renewal. And he argued, from decades of working with people at the end of their capacity, that this is the quadrant that most burned-out people have completely abandoned. Think about your actual daily structure right now. How much of what fills your time was chosen by you from a place of genuine value and priority, and how much accumulated through obligation, habit, and the inability to say no? You may discover that your current life is largely a set of commitments made by an earlier version of you who is not yet paying attention to what things cost. What rebuilding looks like in practice is not dramatic. It looks like inserting one non-negotiable act of restoration into each day before the day has permission to demand everything else. Not as a reward for completing everything, as a non-negotiable foundation that the rest of the day is built on top of. The practical tool for this chapter is the foundation first practice. Identify one restorative act that takes between 15 and 30 minutes and that genuinely returns something to you. A walk, quiet reading, movement, stillness, whatever your honest body says it needs rather than what productivity culture says you should want. Schedule it for the first available moment of your day. Not last. First. And then protect it with the same seriousness you would protect a meeting with someone else. This single structural shift begins to rebuild the message to your nervous system that your needs count before the world's demands arrive. Recovering sustainably means building differently, not just resting and returning, designing something new. The chapter that follows this one is perhaps the most important of all because it is about the belief system underneath the burnout and whether you are willing to let it change. Chapter 9, The Permission You Have Been Waiting to Give Yourself. Somewhere in you is a belief that has been running quietly in the background of everything we have talked about in this audiobook. It has been there since before the burnout. It was probably there since before you were old enough to question it. And it sounds something like this. I am allowed to rest when I have earned it. I am allowed to need things when I have given enough. I am allowed to be human when I have been sufficiently useful. That belief is not the truth, but it has been operating as though it is. We absorbed conditional permission from the environments that shaped us, from families where love was expressed through service and sacrifice, from schools and workplaces that rewarded performance and subtly punished stillness, From a culture that worships productivity and treats ease with a kind of suspicion, as though enjoyment that was not preceded by suffering is somehow stolen. Here is what I have come to understand about that belief. It is not a personal failing. It is a transmission. Something passed on, usually without words, from people who were also carrying it. Brené Brown, the researcher and storyteller whose work on vulnerability and worthiness has opened up genuine conversations for millions of people who thought they were uniquely deficient, spent years studying what she called the hustle for worthiness, the exhausting pattern of trying to earn through achievement and performance the sense of being enough that was never conditionally available in the first place. Her finding, replicated across thousands of interviews, is that worthiness is not something you achieve. It is something you claim. And that claiming it requires releasing the belief that you have to earn it first. In your daily life, this shows up as the inability to receive good things without immediately asking what you did to deserve them. It shows up as guilt when the day ends and something is left undone. It shows up as the peculiar discomfort of being genuinely cared for, the instinct to deflect, minimize, explain away the care because receiving it without earning it first feels like a violation of some internal rule. The work of this chapter is not to suddenly believe something different. You cannot argue yourself into worthiness. The work is to begin behaving as though you are already worthy before the feeling fully arrives. Because the feeling follows the behavior, not the other way around. The practical tool for this chapter is the permission statement. Write a single sentence that begins with, "I do not need to earn the right to." Finish it with something specific that you have been withholding from yourself until you felt you had done enough. Examples: I do not need to earn the right to rest on a Tuesday. I do not need to earn the right to say no without explaining myself. I do not need to earn the right to enjoy today while things are still unfinished. Write it. Read it daily. Say it to yourself in the specific moments when the old pattern tries to reassert itself. This is not affirmation. This is practice, the slow, deliberate rewriting of a rule that was never yours to begin with. If this audiobook is adding real value to your life, do not keep it to yourself. Share it with one person who needs to hear this today. You might not realize it, but that one share could genuinely change someone's life. You have been waiting for permission from outside yourself for a very long time. The next chapter is the last one, and it is about what it means to stop waiting. Chapter 10, The Person You Are Becoming. Do you remember the moment we began? The alarm going off, the face in the mirror, the flatness where feeling used to live, the sense of moving through your own life at a careful distance from it. That person did not press play today by accident. That person pressed play because underneath the numbness, there was still something that wanted more than this. Something that refused to fully believe this was permanent. Something that had not entirely given up on the version of life that feels real and spacious and genuinely yours. That was not weakness pressing play. That was the first act of a very specific kind of courage. Let me walk back through what we have covered together, not as a list, but as a thread. You began by understanding that numbness is not who you are. It is what your nervous system does when it has been running without enough resources for too long. You looked at the invisible emotional labor you have been carrying, the daily cost of managing your inner world so that everyone else's outer world runs smoothly. You named the role guilt has played, not as a moral compass, but as the mechanism that kept the depletion running by making rest feel unsafe. You understood what burnout is doing in your body below the level of thought and why ordinary rest is not enough to address it. You sat with the truth about certain relationships, that love can be real and still be draining, and that seeing that clearly is not betrayal but honesty. You looked at the identity you built around endurance and began asking the question of who you are when usefulness is not required. You started the slow work of returning to physical presence and sensory aliveness, understanding that feeling comes back through the body before it comes back through the mind. You looked at what rebuilding actually requires. Not just rest, but structural change, beginning with the decision to resource yourself before the world takes its share. And you arrived at the permission question, the belief that your worthiness is conditional, and the practice of releasing it before you feel ready to. I want to be honest with you about something before we close. This work is not linear. You will have days that feel like proof you are healing and days that feel like proof you are back at the beginning. The tools in this audiobook will sometimes feel within reach and sometimes feel like they belong to a version of you have not yet fully become. That is not failure. That is the actual shape of recovery, uneven, non-dramatic, accumulating quietly in the direction of wholeness even when you cannot see the movement from where you stand. Here is what I want you to carry from this audiobook, not as techniques but as principles to return to on any difficult day. You are not what you produce. You never were. Rest is not a reward. It is a requirement, as non-negotiable as breathing. Guilt is not evidence. It is a conditioned alarm, and you are allowed to feel it without obeying it. You do not have to earn the right to your own life. Feeling will return. Slowness is not failure. Quiet is not emptiness. The person you are in the process of becoming looks like this. You wake up and the morning is texture. Not every morning, but more mornings than before. You move through your day with a new kind of attention, not perfect, not without difficulty, but more honest. When someone you love asks how you are, you can sometimes give them a real answer instead of the managed one. You catch yourself resting without guilt and notice that nothing catastrophic happens as a result. You begin to feel, in small specific moments, the genuine satisfaction of a life that includes you rather than one that is built entirely around what you do for everyone else. Small things break through. A piece of music, a quiet evening, a morning walk, and they land. They actually land. You are not the person who pressed play in the darkness before the alarm finished ringing. You are not yet fully the person you are becoming. You are in between. And in between is exactly where transformation lives. Here is the closing truth that I want to leave with you. You spent years learning how to need very little, how to function on low, how to give without replenishing, how to go through the motions when the feeling had long since gone quiet. That was survival. That was intelligence. That was you making the best of what you had available. And now, for the first time perhaps, you have the understanding to build something different. Not a life without difficulty, but a life that includes your own reality as something worth tending, worth protecting, worth returning to. The healing is not ahead of you somewhere in the future. It has already begun. It began the moment you decided this was worth understanding. And it will continue, imperfectly, stubbornly, beautifully for as long as you keep choosing yourself as someone worth coming back to. If this audiobook gave you something real, subscribe to this channel and stay on this journey with me. The next audiobook goes even deeper into how to rebuild your identity and sense of self after years of losing yourself in roles and relationships. Share this with someone who needs it today. And until next time, keep growing, keep choosing, keep becoming.